Good afternoon. This is the first Friday lunch forum of the semester. I'm Leora Vysotsky, Managing Director of CAD. We have several people to introduce today, so I'll be quick and just introduce you to our host, Dr. Fernando Lara. Professor Lara came to UT 12 years ago, and all this time he has consistently experienced CAD Friday lunch forums as one of his favorite traditions at the school. Thank you for saying that, Fernando. So much so that he keeps coming back to present and conduct exciting conversations. Beyond dreaming about being back in Battle 101 in person, Professor Lara directs the PhD program in architecture and writes about how we can decolonize the spatial history of our continent. This event today is just one more step in that direction. Dr. Lara also just completed his term as one of the inaugural board members at CAD. So Fernando, thank you for bringing us this dialogue today.
Thank you, Leora. It's a pleasure to be back on the Friday lunch forums. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom and have never been on Battle 101, it's an amazing experience to be in that room every other Friday and have a sandwich with those amazing conversations. We have our faculty and some of our advanced students presenting 5-6 times per semester, and it is just an amazing lunch that we have together. And I'm very lucky because every time I present one of those forums, it becomes a book. So I'll introduce our guests and I will talk about all those books as I speak. Ana Maria Leon teaches architectural history and theory at the University of Michigan with a focus on transnational connections across the American continent. She is the co-founder of several research and practice collectives, including Nuestro Norte El del Sur and the Setter Colonial City Project. And she's the author of the recently released Modernity for the Masses, Antoni Bonet in Buenos Aires, which is an amazing book I strongly recommend. Ana Maria is the author of a chapter of one of the books that Felipe and I organized, and it's coming up next year. Ana Paula Curi teaches at the Universidade de São Judas and Universidade Mackenzie in São Paulo. She was co-PI of a grant that we had together, one of the UT FAPESP grants back in 2013. And as a result of this grant, we wrote a book together. And this book called Street Matters is coming up with the Pittsburgh University Press next year. We have the copy edits to work in the coming few weeks. She's also the author of 2 books on the Arquitetura Nova group, one specifically on Rodrigo Lefebvre, and she's the co-author of the celebrated series on social housing in Brazil with Nabil Bonduki. Luz Marie Rodrigues Lopes has a PhD in architectural history and theory. She co-founded the CIHTAD Puerto Rico Research Collective and was Associate Dean and Interim Dean at the School of Architecture, Universidad Pontificia Católica de Puerto Rico. She has published widely and wants to decolonize the archive of architecture education. Yara Maite Colon Rodrigues has a PhD in history and theory of architecture. She co-founded CIHTAD with Luz Marie Rodrigues. She has taught at various institutions, was the editor of the magazine Polymorpho, and she currently is a historic preservation specialist with the Puerto Rico State Historic Conservation Office. Felipe Hernandez teaches at the Department of Architecture, University of Cambridge, UK, where he's joining us from today. Currently, he serves as the director of the Center for Latin American Studies and director of studies at King's College. Last year, right before the pandemic, Felipe and I were able to organize this colloquium on decolonizing the spatial history of the Americas that brought 20 people here to Austin. And we have 2 books coming out of that colloquium. One that is already shipped from the printing press and should arrive here anytime next week, which is the Center 24. Thank you for the Center for American Architecture and Design for sponsoring our proposal. And the Center 24 is then ready. It's called Decolonizing the Spatial History of the Americas. The other book is being edited and will be published by Cambridge Scholars next year. Felipe also has published 2 monographs, Beyond Modernist Masters and Baba for Architects, and was the editor of Transculturations, Rethinking the Informal City, Marginal Urbanism, and those 2 books that we are doing together. I mentioned that because this celebration of Paulo Freire's centennial will also become a book. The people that I invited today have written papers, and the journal Vitruvius in Brazil will publish the papers when a special issue on September 19th, which is the birthday of Paulo Freire, September 19th, 1921. For those of you who don't know Paulo Freire much, it's interesting, and I will try to explain why very briefly before inviting my guests to speak about his work. Paulo Freire is by far the most important educator of the 20th century. With nearly 500,000 citations, he is the only scholar from the Global South among the 20 highest numbers of citations in history. His best-known book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, published first edition 1970, is the 3rd most cited in all the social sciences. In the words of Cornel West, Paulo Freire is the exemplary organic intellectual of our time. If Antonio Gramsci had not coined this term, we would have to have invented to describe the revolutionary character and moral content of Paulo Freire's work and life. It is safe to say that his classic work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, was a world historical event for counter-hegemonic theorists and activists in search of new ways to link social theory to the narratives of human freedom. One could imagine that the monumental work of Paulo Freire would have influenced the field of knowledge of architecture and urbanism. After all, we are designers and educators at the same time, but that's not the case. A detailed search for Freire in architectural journals reveals that our field does not respond to his work in the same magnitude as the humanities in general. And that's the reason for organizing this forum and the publication. Even more intriguing is the absence of analysis of the spatial dimension in Freire's own work. There are few and recent works that study Freire pedagogical theories through the variable of space. I dare to propose or hypothesize that Freire does not have the same penetration among architects and urban planners that he achieved in other fields of knowledge, because his main contribution to the world of ideas is to relativize the hegemony of abstraction through the appreciation of concreteness, something perceived as a fatal wound to the myth of the modern architect manipulating abstract spaces. And those of you who know me know that I've been working about this issue of abstraction as a problem, as a pandemic that we need vaccination against. In Freire's own word, education as a practice of freedom, unlike that which is a practice of domination, implies the denial of the abstract, isolated, loose, disconnected man from the world, as well as the denial of the world as a reality absent from man. So with that brief introduction, I will invite my guests to speak a few minutes each about how Paulo Freire influenced their work and the field of design and planning at large. Perhaps we can start with Ana Maria Leon.
Sure, and thank you so much, Fernando. Thank you for including me in this conversation. I just want to confirm that you can see that screen. Yes?
Yes.
Perfect. I'm honored to join this conversation from the University of Michigan, which occupies the territories of the 3 Fire peoples, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. As I work and live on these territories, I recognize Indigenous sovereignty, the ongoing effects of colonization and colonial state violence, and the global struggle for self-determination of indigenous communities. Paulo Freire, in his sort of canonical work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, defines critical consciousness as the ability to intervene in reality in order to change it. His work prompts us to learn to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and to take action against the oppressive elements in our reality. It seems to me that today, situated as we are between the interrelated forces of white supremacy, environmental destruction, and a quickly evolving pandemic that has ruthlessly targeted the most vulnerable groups in the world, we are in urgent need of critical consciousness as part of all pedagogical processes, and particularly as the primary goal of architectural education. Today, I will reflect on this call to action against oppression by briefly situating Paulo Freire as part of a long conversation on oppression and its undoing. And I'm going to do this by looking at very quickly at two precedents and two more recent texts. And this is basically the framework of my architecture lecture, both of the whole semester and of the first day of class, which we had last week. The first precedent that I would like to sketch out is the Lordship and Bondage passage from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel is interested here in the development of self-consciousness through the recognition of an other, and thus he narrates this metaphorical encounter of two beings in which their desire for recognition leads to a confrontation. The overpowered subject becomes the slave, and the triumphant will becomes the master, who forms their identity from the recognition of the slave. But this is a false recognition. The master forms their identity from an entity that they don't recognize in return, and this paradox of the master is what Hegel calls an existential impasse. Hegel's dialectic is resolved through the labor of the slave, who, by working and changing their environment, experiences their own agency in the world and achieves a recognition of their own self. Alexander Kojève, a close reader of Hegel, added a Marxist spin by stressing this empowering moment of the slave as key to a higher form of liberation. However, in the Hegelian dialectic, liberation and self-consciousness is problematically achieved by means of servitude. The second text I want to highlight is Transphonons, The Wretched of the Earth, in which Freire read while he was exiled in Chile, finishing the writing of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And Freire mentions his book was almost finished, and he had to rewrite it in order to be able to quote Fanon. While Sossenbach-Morse has speculated that the Haitian Revolution inspired Hegel's dialectic, it was Fanon who transformed this framework into a reflection on racialized oppression and the long consequences of slavery. However, for Fanon, the master is no longer concerned with the slave's recognition, but rather focused on extracting labor, a concern of capital over consciousness. Fanon is concerned with what he calls colonized intellectuals, native intellectuals that replicate the role of the master and continue the same patterns of exploitation. In the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire echoes Fanon, quotes Fanon, and echoes his concern on possible missteps of the oppressed in the path towards liberation, specifically in his chapter Antidialogics. Thinking with Fanon, Freire's pedagogy stems from changing the structural patterns of exploitation by thinking about the means by which the oppressed can participate in the formation of critical consciousness, thus a pedagogy of rather than for the oppressed. Servitude here is no longer a step prior to liberation like in Hegel. Rather, critical consciousness, no longer self-consciousness, but critical consciousness, assembles communities together, breaking the master-slave dichotomy. This co-education or radical empathy, which is how I think about it to myself, is key to Freire's pedagogy, but it has been the focus of critique by later scholars. In her own pedagogical treatise, Teaching to Transgress, Bell Hooks discusses her friendship and intellectual conversation with Freire throughout the years, quoting him also as the epigraph to the book, as well as the evolution of his position over time. So she opens the book with a quote from Freire's Pedagogy of the City from 1991, which was published in English in '93, only 1 year before her own work. And I think this just points to how closely Hooks has read Freire. And she later quotes from Learning to Question. So she also quotes from another book of Freire, not only from Pedagogy of the Oppressed, in order to describe Freire's recognition of the feminist critique of his own work and of the role he must play in feminist and race movements. So Hooks quotes Freire saying, if the women are critical, they have to accept our contribution as men, as well as the workers have to accept our contribution as intellectuals, because it is a duty and a right that I have to participate in the transformation of society. Then the women must know that their struggle also belongs to us, that is, to those men who don't accept the machista position in the world. And the same is true of racism. As an apparent white man, the question is to know if I'm really against racism in a radical way. And if I am, then I have a duty and a right to fight with Black people against racism. More recently, this sort of radical empathy of Freire has been criticized by Aleut scholar Eve Tuck, writing with Kei Wayne Yang the important essay, Decolonization is not a Metaphor. Tuck and Yang contrast Freire and Fanon to highlight their different positions regarding decolonization. And they argue that for Freire, the categories of oppressed and oppressor are abstract. And they contrast Freire to Fanon, for whom liberation, they argue, is always positioned in the specifics of colonization and the identities imposed by colonization. In the essay, Tuck and Yang are concerned that using the term decolonization as a metaphor depoliticizes the term and separates it from its core meaning, the rematriation of land back to indigeneity. Tuck and Yang find themselves in tension with what they see as Freire's ahistorical position and the lack of recognition of the role of colonialism and settler colonialism in the production of disparities. I empathize with Tuck and Yang, and I am in solidarity with the claims of indigenous peoples from the Anishinaabe to the Tehuelche and the Mapuche, who continue to struggle and fight for their rights. But I think their critique of Freire lacks a little bit of historical context. While it's true that Pedagogy of the Oppressed does not dwell on the consequences of colonialism and settler colonialism, it is a work of direct action against these consequences. Freire's pedagogy was first developed as a reaction to the specifics of 1940s Brazil, when literacy was a requirement to vote. And the book is written in the late 60s while Freire was exiled in Chile, directly linked to the growing political oppression of the Brazilian military dictatorship. Freire's imprisonment and exile testified to the military junta's recognition of the political threat of his efforts. Focused on the conditions of settler colonialism in North America, Tuck and Yang are perhaps not aware that the dictatorships of the Southern Cone, and as the case of Bolsonaro has made explicit, have had and continue to have close ties to the very settler colonial military forces responsible for indigenous genocide in the South. I learned from Tuck and Yang, and I acknowledge the problem that they point in Freire's work, but I also understand that Freire's, what they describe as Freire's ahistoricity, comes from the specifics of his exile. Tuck and Yang's critique of Freire reveals the need for more Pan-American conversations like the one that we're having today, conversations that understand and look at the links and differences across our territories and acknowledge the necessity for radical empathy, as clarified by Freire later and cited by Hooks, that we all have a duty and a right from our different identities to participate in the transformation of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana Maria. Let me invite Ana Paula Curi.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you, Fernando, for the kind invitation and this exciting meeting about Freire's work. What I would like to present for you is a master thesis of Ana Buin, which I am the supervisor. We are focused on the pedagogy of the building site. It is the building site as a device for political approach in architecture, in Brazilian architecture. It is a piece of my first work on Grupo Arquitetura Nova, the work on Sérgio Ferro, Flávio Império, and Rodrigo Lefebvre. They were a group in which they subvert the social approach of modern architecture in Brazil toward a social build as a workforce in the building site. And I think this point, it was very important to spread the criticize of the building site, which was written by Sérgio Ferro in 1967 and so on. He rewrote that in other pieces in 72 and 79 and so on. But Rodrigo Lefebvre had reorganized this criticism in the building side and started to develop a center of the working force and the culture of migrants in the contribution of building site in the Brazilian realm. And then he wrote his master thesis in 1981, and he stated the pedagogy of building site, not as building site, but as camps for the transition toward future. And then in this very exciting piece of his PhD thesis, he developed the culture. He studied in very deep way the culture of migrants, and he used the Paulo Freire pedagogy to construct a diagram, a block of phases in which architects and the workers in the building site could interact toward a renewed pedagogy also for the schools of architecture. They think on the both sides will be transformed by this interaction. Not only the workers in the building site were a part of the transformation, but the architects in the other side will be transformed by the migrants, the culture of the migrants. And he used the pedagogy of oppressed from Paulo Freire, but he used also other contributions from the folklore studies and from urban anthropologists, which had studied the culture of migrants in the urban realm, in the urban transition in Latin America. So Ana Buin and I, we organized this approach in one chapter of her master thesis, which will be defended on next month. And we wrote this article in collaboration. And I think it was a very nice experiment because as Fernando had asked us to do that, we should reorganize the role of Paulo Freire in this model, which Rodrigo Lefebvre organized his diagram for the social, toward the social and the social organization in the future. It is a transition from rural to urban society. It is a transition from the capitalist model toward a utopian society, an utopia. And it was put in the center of the building site, the pedagogy of transformation from the stakeholders of the architectures, the architects and the workers. So it is, I expected it was a contribution for this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ana Paula. Let me invite Luz Marie and Yara.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you, Fernando, for the invitation. And it's really Nice to see everyone who's working on these topics and have the opportunity to discuss Freire. Yara and I will be delivering our pitch in Spanish. Being from Puerto Rico, in alignment with Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, it's important for us to communicate in our language, even though we recognize it's the language of the colonizer. And as part of our own decolonizing message, we want to bring attention and underscore the fact that scholarship is also produced outside of English. So we'll do our best to speak slowly. Cuando hablamos de los estudios del ambiente construido, sabemos que hay múltiples factores y pensadores que pueden agenciar manipulaciones e interpretaciones de los espacios. Sin embargo, nos enfocaremos en las disciplinas de la arquitectura y del diseño en el contexto particular puertorriqueño, a pesar de que creemos que será fácil trazar conexiones con otras geografías donde se instala la opresión. Paulo Freire importa para los estudios del ambiente construido porque sus posturas conforman un referente desde el cual no solo podríamos transformar la filosofía vinculada a la educación, entre comillas, de la arquitectura y el diseño, sino también las teorías y las prácticas canónicas occidentalistas que históricamente han impulsado los actos de producir ambientes en muchos espacios oprimidos. Su corpus teórico nos instiga a problematizar los modos en que se interviene para producir los espacios que sirven al ser humano, así como las posturas que asumen los arquitectos y diseñadores como autores, autoras, productores, productoras, educadores, educadoras dentro de los sistemas de la autoridad. La lectura de la obra de Freire, cuando se contrasta con la educación de la arquitectura y el diseño en Puerto Rico, que es el caso que nos toca a Yara y a mí, nos permite identificar faltantes o carencias. Desde nuestro punto de vista, Paulo Freire nos ofrece estrategias que podemos implementar para formalizar procesos de descolonización en la educación de la arquitectura y el diseño y por defecto en las prácticas profesionales, más allá de lo metafórico por donde transitaba hace un rato Ana María. Si extrapolamos la definición que ofrece Freire de la educación opresora, es decir, y cito, la conquista creciente de los oprimidos por el opresor, cierro la cita, podríamos decir que esta se puede intercambiar con colonización. Ambas están ancladas en la antidialogicidad a la que Freire se oponía, por lo que encontramos en su teoría una serie de tácticas para hacerle frente, es decir, para descolonizar. Como mujeres puertorriqueñas, a nosotras nos resulta patente la correspondencia entre los oprimidos con los sujetos colonizados. Reconocemos la colonización entonces como una de esas situaciones límite que Freire no pasaría inadvertida, y nos parece que en una ocasión como la conversación que estamos teniendo hoy, él nos alentaría a trazar y subrayar esa correspondencia. Desde los postulados del teórico brasileño, las pedagogías normativas de la arquitectura y del diseño son de fondo antidialógico. Siguen un modelo bancario, según lo define Freire, que entrena a arquitectos y diseñadoras que además en Puerto Rico son entes colonizados a la vez que colonizadores. La educación a la que nos referimos también asume al estudiante como un objeto pasivo y vacío a quien los profesores y profesoras deben depositar su conocimiento y hasta corregirlo.
Un acercamiento alineado con Freire supondría practicar una educación emancipadora, colectiva, democrática y en los mejores casos solidaria, que formaría arquitectas, diseñadoras, diseñadores, ciudadanos, ciudadanas críticas y, o según consigna el pedagogo, problematizadores. Es decir, conllevaría a transformar las escuelas de arquitectura y diseño para que se sostengan en una pedagogía de la pregunta en lugar de continuar funcionando desde lo que nosotras estamos llamando las pedagogías de la mímesis. Es decir, en el modelo basado en la reproducción y la consecuente perpetuación de unas visiones de mundo y de valores impuestos que atentan contra la humanidad de los oprimidos y que estrangulan nuestras identidades así como nuestra capacidad de agenciar espacios verdaderamente necesarios. Las dimensiones ético-políticas de la pedagogía propuesta por Freire sustentan que, por un lado, los profesores, estudiantes, ciudadanos se conviertan en seres activos, esto es, ni sumisos ni silentes, capaces de intervenir en y con el mundo, y por otro lado, entender que ni la historia ni el presente están predeterminados, sino que siempre están en proceso de construcción. Además, ese reconocimiento y esa reflexión extendida a nuestra situacionalidad nos podría llevar a pensar de un modo histórico y futural nuestra existencia y nuestra participación en la opresión. En la educación liberadora de la arquitectura y el diseño, el proceso de conocerse críticamente como oprimidos u opresores también se desplazaría entre el instigar, el cuestionar, el pensar, el dialogar, más el investigar las ideologías para denunciarlas y, por consecuencia, ¿verdad?, desafiarlas. La educación esperanzadora por la que Freire aboga propone abolir la cultura del silencio. Uno de los problemas fundamentales dentro de la educación que nos ocupa, y más aún en el contexto colonizado, es que típicamente no se enuncian las preguntas que podrían revelar en favor de qué y quiénes, o en contra de qué, y contra quiénes se ha ejercido y se ejerce la autoridad. Y esto es necesario en la arquitectura y el diseño por tratarse de disciplinas que disciplinan. El proceso de formación no culmina, o así debería ser. Para construir las escuelas de arquitectura y diseño freireanas, la pregunta, la esperanza, la indignación, el amor, la humildad, la maña, el riesgo, la dignidad y la brega tienen que figurar dentro de los procesos y contenidos con los que se pretende formar a las arquitectas y diseñadoras emancipadoras y con los que se conforma el equipo de docentes sin caer en una contrahegemonía, como bien advertía Freire. En resumen, habría que revisar las disciplinas para hacer que quepan las indisciplinas, digamos. En definitiva, y como desarrollamos más ampliamente en nuestro texto, Paulo Freire importa para los estudios del ambiente construido, porque sin él continuaríamos obviando la importancia de un profesorado crítico, seguiríamos reproduciendo el elitismo, continuaríamos duplicando las imágenes y ejercicios formales importados del norte, seguiríamos dejando de lado nuestras tradiciones constructivas, continuaríamos con una educación fragmentada e incoherente y seguiríamos evadiendo nuestra responsabilidad ético-política. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Lucy, Yara. Thank you so much. Let me invite Felipe.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
I hear you okay.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Fernando. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the initiative to create this wonderful opportunity for us to discuss Freire's work and the potential of critical pedagogy to re-examine and reconstruct architectural education and, by extension, practice. And I'm delighted to follow after Luz Marie Yara, because I very much try to orientate my reading of Freire in order to connect with the terms in which architectural practices in Latin America are constantly approached by academia, sort of a kind of plural academy from different parts of the world. So I feel lucky to follow after you, and thank you very much for that very interesting interpretation, but also very useful interpretation of the work of Freire. So the Pedagogy of the Oppressed is a fascinating book. You obviously, for those of you who have not read it yet, I think highly recommend it. But it's not only a very controversial book full of relevant arguments to our time. I was constantly reading the book and making connections to what's happening right now in Colombia at the moment. So I am in Colombia now, not in Cambridge, Fernando. But it's been wonderful to sort of read the book from here. So it was difficult for me to narrow down the topic, which is why I decided to focus on the concept of conscientisation. Interestingly, the desire to create consciousness was part of a collective intellectual agenda in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s. And let me briefly recall two other books, two contemporary books, in order to situate the pedagogy of the oppressed in that intellectual context of Latin America in the 1960s. And the first would be Ciencia Propia y Colonialismo Intelectual by Orlando Falsborda, which I think connects very directly with Ana Maria's reading of Fanon and that intersection between Fanon and Freire. And the other book is Las Venas Abiertas de América Latina by Eduardo Galeano. Both books coalesced around the idea of liberation, as well as the urgent need to develop our own science, our science, a Latin American way of thinking, and to rediscover knowledges occluded by several centuries of intellectual colonialism in order to dismantle structures of domination, dependency, and oppression. Galeano embarks on an ambitious revision of Latin American history, arguing that Europeans and later European countries and later the United States have extracted resources and exploited the region throughout its entire history. So they suck the continent's blood, literally and metaphorically. In turn, Orlando Falsborda argues that social scientists in the third world, to use his own words, are oppressed by epistemological systems which diminish their ability to understand and subsequently to transform the world around them. And this follows from Ana Maria, from Luz Maria and Yara. That is why Freire embarks, Falsborda embarks on a process of conscientização, making social scientists in Latin America aware of their situation, their position within international circuits of knowledge production, and urging them to free themselves from intellectual colonialism. In so doing, Falsborda establishes a decolonial agenda, even though decolonial discourse has not acquired its present form. In the words of Arturo Escobar, Falsborda and Galeano estremecieron el edificio epistémico de las academias y empezaron a labrar los cimientos para que se pudieran empezar a tomar en serio lo que hoy llamamos los conocimientos otros de los mundos subalternos. It is in this intellectual context that I would like to situate my reading of Freire, to review the potential inherent in his work to transform architectural academia and practice. I strongly contend that in current pedagogical systems, architecture emerges as a colonizing discourse whose singular true history conveys the culture, the norms, and values of the architectural discipline, while simultaneously occluding other forms of thinking, making, and living. And in so doing, the hierarchies embedded in architectural history reassert the authority of Western epistemology and dictate the terms in which we ought to think about buildings and cities, ultimately dictating how we should live in them. Freire Pedagogy of the Oppressed instigate a revolutionary revision of architectural education so as to reclaim the right to speak against such dominant epistemologies. And I very much enjoy the use of this, the right to speak, the connections that can be created with other more contemporary positions in relation to dismounting sort of structures of epistemological domination. But on the other hand, in addition to education, on the other hand, I also contend that current architectural education hinders creativity in the sense that many practitioners are unable to engage critically with the current needs and conditions of the entire gamut of urban residents in Latin America, who are by no means a homogeneous mass. Instead, they keep replicating typologies: office building, shopping mall, or the 1, 2, 3 bedroom apartment or house in different sizes depending on budget, instead of questioning notions of the house and habitation. So how can architecture, adopting a critical pedagogy, adopting a critical and analytical position in reaction to certain dominant discourses, could actually question notions as important as the house or the very notion of habitation. What is domesticity? It could easily be argued that architects are oppressed by both education and market, and this prevents them from being able to transform conditions of life in cities throughout Latin America. Ultimately, the need to develop critical awareness, to embrace analytical practices, and to develop a desire to go past common knowledge and received wisdom in order to overcome the limitations of existing practice or practices. And that is why I focus on the notion of conscientisation, largely in agreement that as architects, we need to be conscious of our position within global systems of education, knowledge production, and practice in order to change them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felipe. Well, we have now a little less than 20 minutes for a discussion. Let me open to the audience and see if my fellow colleagues and students have questions for the panel. Well, I have my own question, and I will take advantage of having those wonderful scholars here who engage Paulo Freire to share something that I am struggling with. I'm struggling with the fact that I think from reading the whole decolonial literature and from reading you guys, MicroLeads, who are here with us on Zoom today, that abstraction, as spatial abstraction, as it was developed in the 16th century during the European occupation of the Americas, is central for the processes of exclusion and inequality that we have today. Now, how do we counterbalance abstraction? Freire is an amazing example of that counterbalance because he doesn't discard abstraction. Abstraction is pretty much necessary to literacy. You learn how to read and write by normalizing a process of abstraction that transform the spoken words into symbols. So that abstraction is very much necessary for empowerment. But he is using terms. I mean, the central tenet of his pedagogy, of his literacy pedagogy, is to use terms, concepts that are part of the quotidian of the rural workers in Pernambuco in the late 1940s, when he was applying that. So how do we transfer that to architecture? What are, I mean, we are, let's say we are trying to make everybody literate on architecture, on how architecture operates, on how space operates, on how spatial arrangements guide us and enforce us. But how do we make everybody literate? And what are the concepts? What are the things that we are missing? I see a straight parallel to the way we teach beginning design. We basically, we get all those young men and women, they are 18, 19, 20 years old, and we tell them to forget everything they ever knew about spaces, about their own living spaces, and we're going to teach them all new. We're going to teach you what spaces are and how to organize and how to arrange, and the values. What are good spaces and what are bad spaces? How can we create a pedagogy that would do to architecture education what Freire did to literacy? That's my question for you guys to start. All of you touched on that, but I think we can develop it further.
Fernando, just to follow your concern with abstraction, I agree that abstraction in a way is it's not the problem, but there has been a particular focus in the North Atlantic architectural discourse to isolate abstraction and form as innocent and make a discourse of form without the ways in which sort of isolating it from its connections to capital, to labor, to exploitation, to power imbalance. And I think this is the problem that you highlight with abstraction, is sort of this isolation of what has been taught by many institutions, particularly in the North, as the main language and the main tool of the architect. And like Ana Paula, for instance, was pointing to the role of the construction worker in the work of Arquitectura Nova, right? Which is directly linked to a Freire framework of understanding the processes of how any cultural production comes to be. I would just note that this sort of first delinking or relinking, right, of the tools of the architecture as broader, part of broader systems of capital, rather than abstracting one isolated thing, would be, I don't know, my first thought in sort of incorporating Freire's pedagogy.
May I follow? I agree. I think that abstraction, that the terms in which architecture has focused on form generation and creating a kind of isolated discourse about the way in which buildings are built, designed, used, and they look like, is an important thing. And it's critical. I think that we certainly ought to question that. But if we go back to Freire's book, the question of abstraction for him, I think, is a circuit. He talks about the terms in which we cannot rely only on abstraction. Abstraction is very important. And I don't know if you remember that beautiful passage of is an anecdote of the photograph with the drunk man, and that the teachers were showing the photo of the drunk man to the classroom, to the people, and they were able to extract from that image discrimination in society, where the teachers were seeing something else. They were going to speak about how damaging drinking is. And I think that's one aspect in architecture that where I think that architectural programs in architectural education in many universities in the world, really, not only in Latin America, sort of abstract the solution from the realities of the people. And one of the things that we need to do, and particularly in Latin America, or at least in Colombia, which is the place in Latin America that I know best, is to reconnect those architectural programs in studio with the realities of the people. So we don't sort of rely on given programs, I don't know, 3-bedroom apartment, that sort of thing, when in reality we should be questioning how do people live in contemporary urban conditions in Latin America. And that, I think, could create that conscientious response to architecture and to cities. That could be one way to connect with this, the issue about abstraction.
So let me jump in this interesting debate. I think the abstraction is a device. So it was used by the Occidental culture to dominate the America, but it is also as a device for the local people. So what Paulo Freire did, if you remember, in 1960, the illiteracy could not vote in the democratic system. It is a very teeny democratic system in which little people could vote. And then when Paulo Freire started to develop his methodology, he mobilized the rural people in the 60s, which were very politically organized, to dispute the literacy in the Brazilian political system. So I think it is a very important part of Paulo Freire is the culture and how this culture is relative from the minority. And then Paulo Freire give to the Brazilian people their own culture and minority culture as a device for fighting a new hegemony, because they are not a minority, they are the majority of the society, but they are treated as minority. And this kind of revolution is very important. And I think, in my humble opinion, Rodrigo Lefebvre could have the perception of that and how to manage that inside of the building side of architecture, and how to connect these both sides of the production of architecture, the design as an abstraction and determination, and the culture of migrants as a device to inform that institutionalized school of architecture. So I don't know. It is my thoughts.
I'm having a little bit of a glitch here on my Zoom, but I think you can hear me. Anybody else who wants to jump in?
Yeah, I think there's also the issue of how do you locate yourself within the idea of what abstraction is and how can you use it. One thing is to keep working or using the idea of abstraction that comes from you from the Western-centric frameworks, or try to go back to the systems of abstractions that are present in our original nations, right? And also, there's some discussion to be had about the issue of language and how is language addressed in architecture as far as graphic language versus verbal language. Because for the most part, when we start teaching in architecture schools, we make students to fold themselves into a graphic system. And in Puerto Rico, we find many instances in when they are told, your drawing should speak for yourself. So in that way, we are losing something, right? Because verbal language is part of the way we think. So it's not about reduction, I think. It's about maybe thinking about an ecology, bringing a little bit of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, an ecology of what abstraction means and how you can use it as a tool.
Anybody else? Oh, Sarah.
Fernando, yeah, I don't really have a specific question because I have to admit that you guys have given me a lot to think about. So I've been listening and I've been taking some notes and I have to sort of digest this conversation. And I want to thank you for your presentations. But this conversation is in a, allegiance to my field. Sometimes I feel that what the architecture schools need to do to their students, as if it's kind of a one-directional way, is move them away from theory and toward history. I have to admit that for me, history, in terms of a lot of the things that you guys are also saying about concreteness and situatedness and embeddedness in stories and social lives, history is the arena that, it does not mix with abstraction, and it forces students away from solution-based thinking when it comes to a design process. I hope. So to me, I don't know if that resonates, but it's something that that this raised?
Sarah, I sort of agree and disagree because I want to claim theory also. I think we teach history differently and we teach theory differently. And we teach Freire in architecture theory, right? We don't need to teach like Auguste Marceau or Colin Rowe, right?
Right.
Let's just teach Freire. Let's teach Transphonons and bell hooks, and let's create a new, new references for architecture theory, the references that we think are relevant. So I don't want to let go. I want to just like recreate what it should have been.
Yeah. And you demonstrated that in your talk in terms of selectively engaging theory, and linking it together in a way that you felt like was relevant to this discussion.
And I feel like perhaps I was not very architectural, but I think it's just the problems posed by folks that are not, I'm borrowing Trujillo's sort of phrase of the North Atlantic, but from folks elsewhere are relevant to the key problems of the built environment that architects need to understand, and they need those tools to understand them.
Yeah.
So I don't want to let go of like claiming, I want to like reclaim that word.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's true. I agree with that entirely. The importance of theory and theorizing as well as historicizing, but I think that doesn't necessarily take us away from verbal language and Luz Marie's point about understanding other ways of conceiving, considering, and discussing space and building, and as some of you may know, I've been working a lot with informal architectures, and I was in a recent discussion about informal architecture where I was told that the difference is that informal buildings and informal settlements are not designed, and by that the architects mean that they are not drawn in paper. But when you look at those very dramatic landscapes and topographies sometimes where those buildings are built, they are designed. They have to be designed because otherwise they would just fall. It's just they've been designed differently. And orality and verbal language, the transmission of knowledge, the terms in which people see space and topography and nature and materials and structure and so on is different and is expressed to a very large extent through oral language, verbal language rather than, and I think that in terms of decolonizing architecture, which relies heavily on this kind of drawn abstraction and including other forms of transmitting architectural knowledge I think is fundamental. And it would challenge us to theorize differently too, because for us academics, we rely on books to be able to theorize. So to what extent can we actually expand that possibility? I think that's fascinating. It's a fascinating conversation.
I'm a first year.
Yeah, I'm just loving this, the whole conversation on language and illiteracy versus informality. But we had another question from
Lydia had a question,
Hi.
I believe.
Yes.
I sorry, not a question. I just wanted to chime in here and say, to your point, Sarah, I value the inclusion of history because I'm a first-year MArch student, and I find that in the theory, there is context, historical context that is missing for me a lot of times to ground me in the theory, and I find myself relying on popular education tools like a coyuntural analysis. That doing things like that helps me ground myself in theory more. And with the talk of language and decolonization, I think decolonization is ultimately an act of healing. So with that, in academia, where is there room for indigenous knowledge systems in the incorporation of theory? Because that is an act of healing. That is decolonization. So that's just the question that I wanted to raise.
Thank you.
I think we have to, those of us who work as educators have to make as much space for all those knowledges as possible. And, you know, yep, that's all I'm going to say.
Yes, Anna, I agree with you. Doing our best to overcome this very thin spectrum of the practice of architecture, which is very elitist and colonized discipline.
I would just add that I am inspired by Freire. I've been inspired to think about the content of what I teach, but also very much about how I teach and the spaces I organize to co-learn with my students. I think we're all educators because I always say we're permanent students. We like to keep learning, and I'm always humbled by how much I learn from my own students. I have tried to think and organize spaces in which that sort of learning together can be facilitated more, which is sometimes a spatial matter. Right now, I'm finally was able to get a room. So now I teach a lecture, not in an auditorium, but in a room full of tables. So groups can work together, right? And I'm organizing a seminar that I'll be teaching in the winter, in which we will be thinking about how to teach the history of architecture with students. So the seminar is a space to sort of rethink how and what to learn in what used to be a survey that was a banking model, right? How do we co-teach and co-learn this together? So I think it's, you know, Freire's work is very relevant to, you know, for the architecture discipline, but I cannot help but continue to think of it as a pedagogue, as someone who works at, you know, who teaches, and he continues to inspire me.
And also studio. I think that studio remains dominant in architectural education. So how can we make the same kind of translations? How can we challenge and rethink the terms in which we teach studio and the hierarchies embedded in the studio practice? I think there are very important questions to be considered in that area as well.
So, talking about studio, on a regular Friday when we met at Battle Hall, we would close the door when people start presenting and open the doors at 1 p.m. because at 1 p.m. students need to leave for studio. So if anybody needs to leave for studio or the classes, the doors are open and we will stay here a little bit longer and continue the conversation. Thank you.